Hello, we're here at the Seattle Antiquarian Book Fair. The date is Sunday, October 12, 2008. My name's Taylor Bowie, and I am speaking with Charles Seluzicki, bookseller of Portland, Oregon, someone I've known for many, many years. Thank you for joining us here for this interview for the ABAA archives. Charlie, tell us a little bit about your background, where you were born, your family, where you went to school, early days.
I was born in 1946 and lived in Baltimore, Maryland, till the late 70s. So I'm really invested in that East Coast experience. Taylor, I don't know if you remember, but just as a sort of a prelude to my move to the West Coast, it was you and Jack Walsdorf who were the first people who I knew in the antiquarian book trade. You responded to an ad in Bookman's Weekly about oyster ephemera, which I was building for the University of Maryland, and Jack Walsdorf was seeking anything to do with William Morris and Kelmscott Press. But growing up in Baltimore, which is known as the Monumental City, you're just filled with the sense of history. As a little boy, Edgar Allan Poe wasn't just a source of scary stories. He was a reality. He was found dead in East Baltimore, not far from where I grew up. As little kids, we used to crawl over the gates of the tiny cemetery where he was buried on Halloween night and read The Raven, as 10-year-olds. It was just a wonderful thing, and you were saturated. We could go downtown, and I knew that Dr. Seuss really did write his book about Mulberry Street in downtown Baltimore. Everywhere you turn. As I grew up, I was born in the hospital that the novelist Thomas Wolfe died in. That's the kind of place Baltimore was.
A lot of literary connections in Baltimore.
Fantastic.
A lot of people are not aware of.
Yeah.
Interesting to juxtapose Dr. Seuss and Edgar Allan Poe.
Absolutely.
But, that's nice. I like
Absolutely.
that.
And I could just go on and on because, of course, as I matured, as I read more, as I had more and more experiences. I was the first one in my family to get a college degree. I got my master's degree at Johns Hopkins in the history of ideas.
Was yours a bookish family at all?
Not at all.
Not at all?
Not at all.
You didn't have books growing up around the house?
Not really, although there is a caveat there, just in terms of the way in which you look, because Baltimore was a great book city in the sense that you had the Enoch Pratt Free Library, which was everywhere. It was a presence, and a great library. As kids, the library was always a destination. I'm not sure whoever told me it should be a destination. It just was.
Seemed like the natural thing.
And somehow that's ingrained into that urban experience. My father, who you met,
I did.
Went to City College in Baltimore, which was City High School, and although he is hardly a well-read man, he had passions for books, and one in particular was Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, that he was convinced was one of the greatest books ever written. And he could quote from it, and he could quote because at City College in the 30s you studied Latin. He could quote in Latin. And this very much, I actually had the good fortune to go to some private Catholic schools in Baltimore where we really did still get exposure to the classics.
So it's clear, even though you don't refer to it as a bookish family, that there was an appreciation of education
Absolutely.
and literature.
Absolutely. absolutely.
How did you get into the book business? That was in Baltimore too, wasn't it?
It's fair to say that somehow, and again, this is just one of those wonderful sort of cultural coincidences, but I grew up, for whatever reason, I had made the transition from Donald Duck comic books to classics comic books, and somehow they opened the way to a curiosity about the classics, and again, the library was always there to feed that need. So I always loved books, and while I did not grow up in a house that was filled with books, everybody has some books, To this day, I remember an autobiography of Geronimo, and I have no idea how that ever entered my house, but there were books. There were books there. There were some books there that I just lie on the basement floor and read. And at some point, and I wish I could be more precise about this, my fascinations became more and more defined, and I simply was oriented to things that were old, the things that were antiquarian. Again, the general environment in Baltimore, these wonderful old museums, the Walters Art, Gallery, and their fantastic collections of medieval manuscripts and Egyptology.
And how wonderful that these things are accessible to a child or anyone
Absolutely.
else in the community. Yeah.
Absolutely. There was a man who many years later I had the good fortune to know and to both buy many books from, was the great American literary critic and poet Malcolm Cowley. And he wrote this lovely essay in which he talked about his youth, and he talked about his parents' benign neglect, how he would wander off at a very early age, sometimes with his .22 rifle in hand in the hills of Pennsylvania, and just wander, and he'd find his way home at dinner time, and that wouldn't have been far from my own experience in East Baltimore, running around Lombard Street, going up to Patterson Park, that again was filled with monuments to Revolutionary War heroes from Poland with names that ended in SKI.
So surrounded by history, it was always like second nature.
Second nature.
Well, how did this lead to your going into the book business?
I was in transition. I had been in graduate school at Creighton University in Omaha, and I had become very involved in the anti-war movement.
Tell us what year this would have been.
That would have been in 1970 when I was actually in Omaha. My number came up, which meant that I wasn't going to be drafted, but I had to do my alternative service to the draft. I worked at a hospital for emotionally disturbed children in Towson, Maryland, for something close to 5 years. At which point it was time for a change. I had enrolled in Hopkins graduate program, and I had already been hanging around John Gatch's shop on Greenmount Avenue, not far from my house, which was all very close to the Johns Hopkins Homewood campus. And a position opened up. And I said, "John, what do you think?" And I just joined the crew, and he was starting to define his business a little more, a little more seriously. He was opening up what we called a library services wing, the book service. Helped him get his cataloging business underway.
Now, this would have been around 1975?
Yes, yes. And during that period, I was completing my master's degree in history of ideas at Hopkins. It was heaven because I was in this new book world, and it was a great time. We were close to New York City, obviously. Jack Bartfield became a regular, a pal. One of the great sort of connectors that links my East Coast experience and my West Coast experience was that I was to later find out when, in part through the agency through the encouragement to move to Portland through Peter Howard at Serendipity Books. He was such good friends with Preston McMahon, a first-generation ABAA member in Portland, Oregon.
The old Oregon bookshop.
Yeah, who became nothing less than a second father to me, a real inspiration, a person from whom I learned a lot. He and Jack Bartfield had been best friends, just the closest of friends. Actually, Jack Bartfield and Frank Sosha, Frank, who had actually lived in a house in Portland next to Mac right after World War II. You know, these two iconic figures that because of my experiences in Baltimore that sort of bore fruit when I came to the West Coast. And this is not to mention a whole generation of New York booksellers who would soon pass. I mean, Margie Cohn was somebody who I would visit regularly.
These were all people that you first met while you were working for Gash.
Yes, and as I began to develop my own interest, particularly in poetry, I had bought books from House of Books Limited, Margie's business, from the time that I considered myself a private collector, you know.
Can you talk for just a little bit about Frank Sosha? He's kind of a legendary figure in the book trade, and I have a feeling a lot of people coming up these days might not have even heard of him.
Well, he had a business, Croton and Hudson in New York City, but I knew him not through that connection. I knew him through Mac, and they were the closest of friends. In the later years, Frank would work for Harper and Row, and he had friendships with giants like Maurice Sendak, who he had known since the beginning of his career. But Frank was so attached to the idea of the book, and he was such an avid reader, and he was the kind of person who had a lot of curiosity and a lot of a kind of bravado, I'm at a loss for words, because he was very adventurous in the way that he accumulated books. That's what he did in his spare time. He really loved books. And if he loved a book, if he read a lot of contemporary fiction, he wouldn't have one copy, he'd have 5 copies. And you'd be damned, even if you were the best friend in the world, he would not sell you all 5 copies. If that author suddenly became hot, you got one at a time, and only at his discretion.
My limited experience with him led me to think that he was more interested in books than in the book business. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I mean, he was in the fortunate position of working for Harper and having this whole other life. One of the biggest mistakes that I made as a young bookseller, shortly after I was actually in Portland, because I had originally, when I moved west, lived in Salem for a number of years. But in the Portland years, one day one day Frank, who'd come out at least once a year to visit Mac and Phyllis, he was over at the house, and he said, Charlie, will you? He said, I'm sort of winding things down. He said, can I send you my poetry section? And I said, well, how many books is it, Frank? And he said, about 10,000.
That's a good start for a poetry section, isn't it?
And I said, there's no way in hell I'm going to fit 10,000 more books into this house. But I should have found a way.
Of course you should have.
Yeah.
There's always room for more books.
Yeah, and of course he bought poetry in the same prescient way that he bought everything else. The guy was tuned in,
He's tuned into his own innate good taste.
Yeah. One of my fondest memories, and it's one of my last memories. It actually is a very emotional memory because Mac, who's very, very sick and not going into the shop, and Frank had come out to visit him. They had made a kind of a sentimental journey back to together. The families traveled back to Presque Isle, Maine, where Mac had grown up, and he wanted to see his town again, and they did. And so Mac was very sick and sitting in his living room, and Frank had brought some books, and they were looking at books, and they sort of had them stacked up around their feet
in their element.
And time disappeared, and somehow they were, young again. I mean, they were just bouncing off of one another, little code words, and Mac, who had this wonderfully sort of irreverent way that he would flip a book on top of a stack of books. He'd look at a book and he'd say, "Now that's a cookie, Frank. That's a cookie," And it was just so wonderful. It was just so wonderful to watch them interact.
Tell us a little about how you transitioned from working at Gatch to having your own business out here in the Northwest.
Well, I had always loved poetry. Gatch had never specialized all that much in poetry. He had a special affection for African American writing, so that made it difficult, or something of a conflict of interest, if a really good Langston Hughes book came in or something. But I had met a woman named Mary Owings Miller, who for decades had published a journal and books under the imprint Contemporary Poetry. And she was a wonderful woman who adored poetry and who had published everybody in contemporary poetry. I mean, the young Robert Lowell, Wallace Stevens, you name. And she had been very interested in Irish and Scottish writing. Actually, published the first separate volume of Hugh McDermott's poems in the U.S. with a little Scots dictionary in the back. She had met Oliver St. John Gogarty, also, and published a couple of books of his. And everybody thought Mary was dead, and I found her, and she invited me over to her house.
So what year would this have been?
And this would have been in the late 70s, probably late 77, early 78. And Mary was perpetually giving me things. And I'd say, "Mary, stop." She'd give me back copies of contemporary poetry, and I'd say, you just can't keep giving me. Then she'd start giving me things like crystal goblets and silver, and I mean, I'd say, and she would say, Charles, she was from North Carolina. Charles, just who exactly am I going to leave this to? I haven't got a child. And she was so beautiful. She was quite a good poet, too, actually.
Really?
But one day, Mary said, Charles, I'd like you to have these. And she had a little envelope. And she had American gold coins in it. And I said, this is absolutely the limit. You can't do it. And she just would not let me get out of there. And I said, Mary, I am going to then, if I'm going to use this to see if I can basically buy the poetry business from John Gatch, which I did. I gave him those gold coins, which he gave to his father. And from that point on, I was Charles Seluzicki, poetry bookseller, that's the way it started.
If we were talking about any other business, this would all be too romantic and fantastic to believe.
Right.
But this is the
gold
book
coins.
trade,
Gold coins. $200 in the bank.
An eccentric Southern lady.
An eccentric Southern lady who was the sweetest thing on this side of whatever.
Did you already had your business then in Baltimore before you moved to the Northwest?
Oh yeah.
Well, tell us about what it's been like here in the Northwest for your business.
I basically I knew we had my wife subsequently divorced, but we had made sort of a deal that after we were married we would live in Baltimore for 10 years, and then we'd try something new out west. And that time was coming close. Our daughter Christina was just 2 years old, and we did in fact. Linda was graduating from University of Maryland Law School. She applied to clerk at the Court of Appeals in Salem, Oregon, where her parents had moved from Iowa. And we did, in fact, move. And I was house daddy. Mm-hmm. I had my book business, a fledgling book business, established.
You have a son also, too.
Yes. He was born a few years later.
What's his name?
Adam. From the Salem time, from the years in Salem, just 3.5 years or something, we had it was just sort of a building time. I just would write to poets. I was ferreting out all kinds of rare first books and doing these little lists that I would send around.
This was around the time you got started publishing some poets. in fine editions as well.
Publishing.
Who were some of those poets you
Oh
published?
my God! Well, the first one was the English poet who I adored, Ted Hughes, who had become the poet laureate, and my idea had always been, Margie at House of Books Limited had her little series, and Bob Wilson at Phoenix Bookshop. Yeah, I mean, all those guys had published books, and that was certainly an inspiration. And I wanted to do something a little different. I wasn't wed to a format like they were.
Right.
I was really very interested in fine press printing in broader terms. It was about that time. It was at the time when I was living in Salem, that little transitional period before we moved to Portland, that I actually became a contributing editor to Fine Print magazine in San Francisco.
Your publications, we should note, I think have a lot more visual appeal. The visual component is much more important in some of the things you've done.
I was very proud 2 summers ago to have a 30-year retrospective of those publications, and that was a great event. Very proud of all that. I could have never guessed that what happened happened.
No, that's a common thread in the book trade. I'd never have guessed how things have come out the way they have, but it's
It was
obviously
wonderful.
been extremely pleasurable
And,
for you.
and needless to say, a lot of the writers that I published, I had relationships with. I handled their archives. I handled their libraries. It was the basis of all kinds of other. I could have never published Seamus Heaney, whose reputation exploded. I published him in 1980. It's the only book of mine that has a Salem imprint, but I could have never published him without the friendship of Hank Pearson, who I had met in Margie Cohn's House of Books Limited in her offices in New York, and I could have never published him without having published his friend and mentor Ted Hughes. I mean, everything.
This is a good illustration of the importance of personal relationships
Absolutely.
in the book trade, far and above many other
Sure.
businesses. Charlie, how do you see? We'll kind of tie this together to conclude. How do you see the future of your own business? How do you see the future of the book trade as a whole?
This is obviously I have very strong feelings about the impact of the internet on the book business. I mean, it's completely changed the culture of the antiquarian book business.
Do you think it's been all for the good, all for the bad, a combination?
The great majority of the impact has been for the bad, because it has conspired to make the economy of the open shop less than viable in most cases. One of the reasons why I love these young booksellers that I see up here at the Seattle Fair is because they've actually magically managed to, through hard work and the good fortune of their location, to keep a lively, open shop, and they've been a success at doing this. So those are all things that I value and support.
And you certainly see a healthy future for those who persevere in the book trade.
I do see that for the few. And I'm not convinced that things will ever operate on a scale that I grew up with, because I grew up in a world. Forget the ABAA for a moment. I grew up in a world that had old books pouring out of venues in an older kind of Baltimore and in just
No, we'll not see
locations.
that again.
No, I mean it's just not. Everybody wants to be in the book business now. Everybody wants to be an antique dealer. They don't have. Mac used to say about young booksellers of a certain ilk. He'd say that he just hasn't seen enough books. I've seen millions of books.
As have I.
I do my business 40 or 50 hours a week, and for pleasure. Stop in other people's bookstores or go to a library or go to a museum show because it just fascinated me and excited me.
Present time, you're not only involved in the book trade, but you've taught classes about the history of the book. I'm going to ask one last question. I have a feeling I already know the answer. Do you see yourself retiring from the world of books?
No, Margie. When I asked Margie Cohn this very question when I was about, maybe in my late 20s, early 30s, Margie was somewhere in her upper 70s. I don't know how the figures work out, but she was definitely an older lady in the book business. And I said one day, Margie, because we'd always get together. She'd call me up. She'd know I was coming up. I'd take the early bus up to New York because her shop was not a big stroll away from the station. And she'd say, I'll have a turkey sandwich waiting for you, And I said, Margie, you ever going to slow down? You going to retire? And you would have thought I said the most insulting thing to her in the world. She was never one to be shy about her opinions. Charles, you know when I'm going to retire? When they take me out of here feet first.
And that's about what happened. Well,
it is.
Charlie?
She died on the way walking to meet with Tom Stoppard in London and looked the wrong way and stepped in front of the truck.
I remember it well.
What a way to go.
Charlie, I hope we all die in the saddle, but maybe not quite so violently. Thank you very much for sitting down to talk with us today.
Thank you, Taylor.
Perfect.